Jonathan Jansen is Distinguished Professor of Education at Stellenbosch University and President of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He is a curriculum theorist, and his research is concerned with the politics of knowledge. His 2022 books include The Decolonization of Knowledge with Cyril Walters of Cambridge University Press, and Bewitched, a study of dysfunction in South African universities. He holds a doctorate from Stanford University and 5 honorary degrees in education. Of course, there's so much more, but I want to allow time for Dr. Jonathan Jansen to present. So please welcome him.
Thank you very much. I certainly look forward to this event. I'm also just want to do a big shout out to the organizers for having this Friday or Saturday seminar on Southern Epistemologies. I think that is a fantastic idea. And I've always wanted to speak at the University of Pennsylvania. Anyway, just a correction that I normally make in when I'm introduced as a distinguished professor, my letter of appointment was actually written by somebody at Stellenbosch University whose first language was not English. And so my letter says I am an extinguished professor of education. So, you know, it might be more accurate in terms of the burnout one experiences. Anyway, delighted to be with you. So I want to start off with a couple of, I don't know how many of you have actually read the little reflection that I wrote and sent to all of you. But I want to start with the role of the social scientist in any society. And that I take to be a critical role. I take that to mean that when an idea or a concept bubbles up in the public sphere, that it is the role of the social scientist to say, what does that concept mean? What could it mean? What should it mean? Where does it come from? Who's pushing the idea behind that particular concept? Who is it for? What is it against? Etc. You don't just swallow a concept because it is put out by CNN or because it is put out by a radical movement. You ask questions about that concept and its meaning and its implications and its consequences. If you look, for example, if you're watching the Russia-Ukraine debacle in Eastern Europe and you only watch CNN, you would get a particular view of that tragedy that might be very, very different if you are looking at the same event from another part of the world. And let me just be clear, what is happening there is a tragedy, just an unbelievable tragedy that should never have happened. But that's not my point. My point simply is, I remember when I was a student in the country where most of you are right now, I remember just going to a lecture in which a professor on the campus in California spent 2 hours just explaining all of the concepts used in the Iraq war at that time that made absolutely no sense, like surgical strikes in Iraq. And I find that to be a particularly powerful way of doing politics, in that you take, unfortunately in South Africa, when the idea of decolonization surfaced, everybody, some just out of pure evangelical fervor, others because of the threat of not being seen as being for decolonization, simply went on this bandwagon. And I remember getting up and speaking about the need for caution in using terms that had never surfaced in South Africa, as I'll explain in a minute, in its entire history, that one needed to take another look at this particular term and its meaning. Needless to say, in presenting the emerging ideas that led to a book on decolonization at the time, it wasn't well received, especially when there were students, I wouldn't call them radical. I mean, radical for me is a good thing, but students who just got caught up in the protest moment, and to speak against it was, for me, read as a fundamentalist Christian, was to question the virgin birth. I mean, you just get thrown out of the assembly, and that's what I experienced, as a complete intolerance for even asking what these terms might mean and what potential they might have in the struggle. And so I think that the fact that in South Africa, so many academics, especially those on the left, who simply followed in the language and the excitement of decolonization in South Africa, I think they were giving up what I think is the responsibility of a social scientist, and particularly a critical social scientist, which is to say, take another look before you simply go down this path in the heat of the moment, and so on. And we haven't had a lot of that in South Africa. And a lot of my colleagues are now sitting with egg on their faces because they realize they should have asked these questions before the disaster that actually was completely predictable happened, which is no change to speak of, especially in the relation to the curriculum. Now, let me also say that, well, let me take a step back, first of all. So that moment, the decolonization moment, is 2015 in South Africa. And it, as many of you know, the students understood that year was an ideal focus for the decolonization protest. And that was a massive statue of the British imperialist Cecil John Rhodes, who was invisible for many years. He sat there, everybody saw him, but they didn't see him. You know, somebody once said there's nothing as, invisible as a statue. And so for generations, students walked past this bronze statue of Cecil John Rhodes, but suddenly became very visible and provided what one of our most distinguished professors called, Akil Mbembe, called an economy, of protest. You could take down this monumental structure, and with great fanfare, media presence, lots of performance, Cecil John Rhodes thankfully came down. But it came down in a way that, for me as an educator, as a pedagogue, as somebody who thinks about teaching all the time, it came down in a way that didn't allow for us to ask, what does it mean when you simply remove what you don't like? Because it's just this gaping space there and there's nothing in its place, in order to ask critical questions about the colonial project to begin with. Be that as it may, that moment resonated across the world with movements of people calling for change. The most direct link to what happened to Cecil John Rhodes on the University of Cape Town campus, as many of you might know, were the protests that centered around a similar statue at Oxford University's Oriel College. And the first reaction of the authorities in Oxford was that they would not take down the statue. And then things got worse in Europe and in the United States. I'll come to that in a minute. And then they went back and said, okay, we still won't take him down, but they put down an explanatory plaque next to the statue of Rhodes in Oxford that describes him, and I quote, as a committed colonialist who exploited the peoples of Southern Africa. In other words, instead of taking it down, we're going to use this opportunity belatedly, and I think also shamelessly in the case of Oxford, to sort of just remind you that this was not a nice dude. There was another almost parallel moment, as many of you know, all of you know, in the United States with the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd. And that set off on the other side of the Atlantic a similar kind of moment that focuses on statues. Now, having been a student and visited back and forth, you know, many, many times to the United States, I always thought, particularly in the southern states, that you'd never see Confederate statues come down, but they did come down in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Around the same time, this flight of consciousness reaches Europe. And as many of you know, in Bristol, the slave trader called Edward Colston, his statue was unceremoniously dumped in a local river. And in East London, a council decided to take down another slave trader's statue, Robert Milligan, before, you know, he also ended up being toppled. I remember years ago when I was invited to speak at universities in Belgium, and I tried very, very hard to have a conversation with my colleagues about Leopold II. And they were point blank not going to entertain this discussion. They absolutely refused. And I wasn't asking, you know, with any aggression or anger or rancor. I just wanted to know, can we talk about King Leopold II, the great damage that he did in the Congo? Nobody would want to talk to me. Well, guess what? They had to talk to themselves very soon after these developments in the USA and then also in the UK. And King Leopold II's statue started to topple in various places, in particular in Antwerp, in Belgium, and so on. And so taken together, these moments are this awakening, this awareness of the colonial project and its legacies was actually a very, very good thing, especially in the context of South Africa rather, but also in the broader context of a world that had not understood. And that's why it's so tragic to see the backlash, in my view, in places like the United States around things like critical race theory. Now, let me just say this as somebody who often gets invited to speak in schools in the United States. You would know this better than me. Schools there don't actually teach critical race theory. It would be nice if they did, but they don't. But this became such a political issue, you know, that, as you know, has very deep roots and very complex explanations in the context of this backlash against progressive politics in North America. So in South Africa, when this moment happened, 2015, through roughly 2016, 2017, if you're generous, the campuses in South Africa we have 26 public university campuses. Not all of them, most of them, and in particular, the former white English universities, like University of Cape Town, like Wits University in Johannesburg, and to a lesser extent, the University of KwaZulu-Natal on the East Coast. Things heat up there quite a bit around, first of all, decolonization, as they called it, and later on refined it after a few visits by Latin American theorists to decoloniality, and then merged that project with what happened mainly at the Black universities, the historically Black universities, which was a project around free access to higher education. And so what students then demanded was a package which was a decolonized, free higher education. That was the sort of merging of these two protest moments. I was particularly interested, with my colleague Cyril Walters, who is online this evening, to try and understand not just what academics meant by decolonization, but in particular, what impacts it might have over a 5-year period in 10 universities that were more intensely engaged in this project. And so Cyril and I literally went around the country, interviewed more than 200 academics, and put together this book, which, as you heard, will be out with Cambridge in hopefully by April of this year. It's called The Decolonization of Knowledge. Now, there were obviously different elements to the decolonization moment. The one element was the complexion of the university academic staff, or what you would call in North America, the professors, because they were too white, okay? And so there was a real focus among the decolonization activists on changing the complexion, overall complexion of the professorial, the staff, the academic staff, or the lecturers in South African terms. The second part of it, of course, had to do with culture, institutional cultures, particularly, again, in the former white English universities, which was seen as being too English, as in too colonial English. And thirdly, the curriculum, and that's where Cyril and I were particularly interested at looking at curriculum, which for me is simply a way of talking about knowledge codified within the disciplines for a particular purpose. And so we looked narrowly at the curriculum. And it was very, very clear to us early on in these 200 odd interviews that there was a problem. And the problem was that despite the incredible pro-decolonization sort of sentiments on campuses, it simply wasn't happening. And what I wanted to talk to you about was why it wasn't happening. And so one of the things that was absolutely fascinating was that the people who were already engaged in the decolonization of knowledge were there before the 2015 moment. In other words, they were doing it all along. But there were very few and far between, number one. And number two, they were people who didn't use the terminology of decolonization to describe their projects. They would speak of transformation, they would speak of, curriculum change or reform, they would speak about inclusive education, but they didn't use the term decolonization. Why not? Because it doesn't exist in South Africa as a term. It exists in Zimbabwe, it existed in Kenya, it existed in Nigeria, it existed in Ghana, as Phoebe will tell you. It did not exist as a political terminology, let alone an intellectual sort of concept in South Africa. And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is we weren't a typical sort of colonial, we were not Mozambique, or Angola or Zimbabwe, where the colonial authority more or less would leave and there'd be a small settler colonial class that remains in the way. There was no colonial power to leave. The settlers had become natives, if I may reverse the logic of Mahmoud Mamdani's original book. And so South Africans don't think of white people as settlers, unless there's some crazy ones on the fringe, but by and large, these are South African citizens who are recognized as such in the Constitution. We don't talk about settlers. There used to be in a very small political party, a struggle sort of song that went something like one settler, one bullet. But I can assure you that does not enjoy any, resonance or acceptance within the broader South African public, even among other radical political parties like the South African Communist Party, let alone the Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, or ANC. So it was a particularly, and every now and again it would come up when somebody tries to get at white farmers for some action they regard as dangerous and so on, and sing one settler, one bullet. But by and large, the South Africans ignore that because it doesn't carry any currency in our politics then or now. And so the notion of a a colonizer and the colonized is something foreign to our political discourse across the board. That doesn't mean it shouldn't have been there. In fact, one of the things that I'm very grateful for the decolonization moment is that it brought into the public discourse a language for what happened before apartheid. Because what we typically do in intellectual circles, we divide South Africa up into the period of colonial rule, and then comes segregation since the 1910s, and then comes apartheid in 1948. So for youth of this generation, my generation, you just spoke about apartheid. It's as if the country started with apartheid. There was no reference in our political struggles to the colonial legacy. So one of the good things that happened in South Africa was that the Rhodes Must Fall moment brought about a public consciousness of our colonial legacy, and not just more recently our apartheid legacy and the like, and that was a good thing. However, in the rush towards this language of decolonization, which, as I said, was never part of our political struggle language, it ran into all kinds of conceptual and political difficulties. One of the conceptual difficulties, as I intimated earlier, is we didn't talk. We never talked about white people as colonials, etc. In fact, as Mahmoud Mamdani puts it in one of his more recent books, he said, and I want to sort of just go back to the paper I sent out to you. He says, you know, South Africa actually made a decision around these things that broke down the colonial distinction between settlers and natives, inviting them to participate in the same political community with settlers reconfigured as immigrants, and even to call them immigrants today would shock people here, because we don't. We simply think of them, black and white, as citizens. And let me just say this as a footnote. One of the tragic developments in South Africa, which I fight against daily in my public writings, in my social media accounts, in my Thursday columns, is to fight back against a growing tendency in, not just on the streets, but in the public sector, in government itself, to having accepted white folk as citizens, is to attack foreign nationals from other African countries as non-citizens, okay? And that is a particularly dangerous tendency in South Africa. Before, it used to be, you know, the people in the townships who were fighting with the Somali shop owner who was appears to be much more successful than the South African spaza shop owner next door. That was, you know, 5, 10, 15 years ago. Now, it is the government of South Africa. In fact, we had a visit to my university, and I was asked to provide data. I lead a program called the Future Professors Program, in which we prepare young academics to become professors. And I was with money from the national government. And I was asked to give a list of South Africans versus non-South Africans on that program. And needless to say, I was disgusted and had something to say about that, etc. So here you have a paradox. On the one hand, you have a political history that includes and recognizes white people, not as settlers, but as South Africans, and that is correct in my view. But now, in the contemporary moment, you exclude people, simply people who look like you, by the way, you know, you exclude them on the premise that these are non-South Africans and non-citizens and all of that nonsense, etc. So that is something that also, I think, as I often say to my students, you know, I don't get it. On the one hand, you are fiery decolonization protesters, but you are also anti-immigrant activists. So just explain this to me. How can you be a decolonization activist but you respect the borders that, without exception, were created by the Europeans, were created for you. Zambia and Zimbabwe were not two different countries. A lot of them were very surprised by that, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're sitting here in a context in which you don't really have a radical project. What you really have is a political project with radical language that doesn't really get to the deeper issues of knowledge and power, of inequality and injustice, of solidarity in the stand against exclusions of all kinds. So don't be confused about South Africa. We might have a very progressive constitution. Everybody tells us that, but we actually have a very conservative society in which tribalism every now and again raises its ugly head, more recently in relation to foreign nationals from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Nigeria, and the like, and so on. So what did we actually find on the ground? When decolonization comes to these universities, Cyril and I found that everybody made up their own meaning. Now, on the face of it, this is probably how it works in the social sciences, right? This is not the natural sciences. Something like decolonization or epistemology and so on can have many different kinds of meanings depending on whom you speak to. That is normal. Okay. But the downside of that is that if there wasn't some attempt to give a guiding set of ideas for decolonization that were widely shared, that in the absence of conceptual definition, everybody made up their own meanings for decolonization that suited their particular politics. So, for example, and this is a very difficult one to explain to my colleagues in Canada and New Zealand in particular, and even in the United States. In South Africa, when you say we want to recognize indigenous knowledge, let me tell you, you couldn't say anything more dangerous, because it makes perfect sense in Canada in relation to Native peoples, in relation to First Peoples, to be able to say we're going to recognize minorities who are not, given their fair share in the curriculum, in the society, in economics, and so on and so forth. Makes perfect sense to me. In South Africa, the entire colonial and apartheid project was premised on the idea that we're different. And therefore, to recognize that difference before we've talked about sameness, before we have settled on our common humanity, before we have agreed on one identity as human beings, in the middle of the struggle to just find each other as one nation, as one group, as one people, you then bring in, let's go and dig up, the authentic Zulu in KwaZulu-Natal, or the authentic Basotho, in the Free State and so on. That is a red flag to a transformation bull. This is asking for trouble. And here's the secret, that when you introduce this open-ended meaning of decolonization, my white Afrikaans colleagues, they ran towards it. And the reason they found this acceptable, it accords with their own notion of 4 racial groups and 10 ethnicities in the Black community. And so, yes, let's look for the authentic Zulu. Let's look for this mixed race group of people called the colored. Let's look. And so you gave decolonization a meaning that corresponded to your own understanding of ethnic politics, using that example for the moment. If you look at a lot of my other white colleagues, it was really difficult to deal with the radical implications of decolonization of knowledge. So what do? They said, this is the meaning we will give it. We will mean good pedagogy. I show up on time, I deliver a good lecture, I break it down into small pieces so that the students can understand. That, for me, I'm doing decolonization. Of course, that's nonsense, but not that good pedagogy isn't part of just a good liberal education. But it's not radical to say that because I am giving you, a sound pedagogy or a fairer assessment that you are practicing anything close to what I think we should mean by decolonization. So for me, this was a huge problem. Everybody gave it their own meanings in the context in which they work and given their particular ideological predispositions. And that was one of the big problems. So why did the student moment evoke the language of decolonization? Quite simple. They were fed up with the ruling party's definition of change, which went by a much more popular term, and that is transformation. The thing is that in much of South African society, transformation didn't happen. The economy is still, not in the hands of the majority of people. And that's not entirely a legacy of colonialism, it's also a legacy of a very corrupt Black government. Let me just put that boldly. We have had now a major commission of inquiry into what we call state capture, when the ruling party and its president literally ripped off this country with the help of the Gupta brothers, from India. And we lost billions and billions of South African currency not because of colonialism, okay, but because of a very corrupt Black government. And it's very hard for South Africans to talk about that, but at least we're recognizing this in these the 3-volume commission reports that is led by Justice Zondo. And so transformation, meaning a deep, deep change in the quality of people's lives when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to economic participation, just hasn't happened. And who feels this the most? Young people, because we have one of the highest unemployment rates among young people in the world. And then, of course, it's not simply this kind of economic misery, it's that it exists in a country in which there are huge inequalities. Just to give you an example, I spoke at a school this morning in Cape Town, I've spoken at some fairly wealthy schools around the world. This wasn't even the wealthiest of schools. And I couldn't believe the wealth dripping from this quasi-public school. And within a few kilometers, I can be in a school in which children still drown in pit latrine toilets. How the hell does this happen? Okay. And again, I want to be very clear. Yes, this is the long, reach and legacy of colonialism and apartheid, but it is also the legacy of a government that doesn't care a damn about the education of the poor, because we spend more money on education, both as a percentage of GDP and as a slice of the national budget than any other country on the continent of Africa. And so when you collapse all of our travelers into and define it as a legacy of colonial rule, then of course you are being disingenuous, because it's a little bit more complicated by that. And that is why I asked the question, why is this language coming up now? And why didn't it come up before? And this is a very, very important part. I'm just going to watch the time here of this difficulty. So everybody did what they felt was decolonization on university campuses. Number two, the really radical projects remain marginalized on campuses and so on. And almost all of those projects were led by African scholars from outside of South Africa. People like Akili Mbembe, people like Innocent Pakaraya, people like Sarah Chiumbe, amazing intellectual people who brought some sense of the radical project into South Africa, but remained on the margins of what we call, Cyril and I call in our book, the institutional curriculum. They're not there in the center of things, because that's not how universities change. So what went wrong here? What could have been done better? One of the big reasons why we didn't have any sense of deep change is that the activists in the decolonization moment were extremely arrogant in the way in which they approach change. They were right, everybody else was wrong, and they were impatient, particularly with those in the sciences. So a professor in engineering or in nanotechnology or in polymer chemistry was simply sort of laughed out of the room because of their conviction. Now, I still think that one of the reasons they had difficulty talking to scientists, natural scientists, is they didn't know how to do that. You see, it's very easy if your club of speakers are people dealing with Southern epistemologies. But when, you know, so you form a community of your own, and you use words like epistemicide, and you expect everybody to know what it means, even though the word itself for me is pretty, you know, uncomfortable. Everything you see is structural violence in a country that is violent in a very direct way towards other people. And so you basically piss off people, you know, who you need to bring into the conversation around decolonization. And that was one of the reasons it didn't gain any traction. So what did people do in senates? They shut up. They said, no, we're not going to get our heads chopped off by this militant minority. We simply will disengage. And that was a big mistake in my view. The second thing is there was no theory of action. You know, I'm a curriculum theorist. If you want to change a curriculum, you better think through the institutional conditions under which curriculum change happens. Otherwise, you end up with what Sarah Amedius so beautifully calls institutional as usual. And so once the political pressure of decolonization subsided, university managers who pretended to go along with all of this, who gave money for commissions on curriculum, who instructed their senates, you know, to lead decolonization, they basically dumped all of those reports. Some of them were even as bold as to rewrite the reports from radical documents into these, you know, sort of silly liberal documents and so on. All of the detail is in this book. That's sort of I don't have time to go into it. And so, in a nutshell, decolonization in South Africa failed, not because the project was radical, but because it wasn't radical enough.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Jansen, for your wonderful insights. I can feel the entire audience has taken in every word you have uttered. So let me yield the floor now to Sinfree, who will engage in a conversation for a couple of minutes before we invite others to come in. Sinfree.
Yes, thanks, thanks, Professor Jansen. I would like to engage in a conversation with you, which takes into account what you have said and the little that I have read about decoloniality. Are you saying, for example, that if decoloniality is to be useful as an analytical category, we need to be clear what it stands for and what it seeks to accomplish? Is that the general argument you are making?
That is correct, sir.
That is correct. Okay. Then if that is the case, my interesting response, I think, is this. Within your research, for example, you said, for example, the students, the protest movements, the administrators, etc. I think because as a former administrator and, as you call yourself, distinguished scholar, you've had an opportunity of moving across different intellectual communities. What are the decolonial views of university administrators in South Africa? What do they think, for example, the vice chancellors, when they hear these particular words, what comes into their minds? We talked about the student protest, so I'm just sort of curious to know what would the vice chancellor of the University of Stellenbosch or Cape Town or KwaZulu-Natal imagine decoloniality to mean when they hear that type of discourse?
Thank you, Prof. McConney. When a South African vice chancellor, I was one of them, used the word decolonization, what goes through their mind is a single word, and that is fear. The fear of, oh my word, they just brought down a very heavy statue at the University of Cape Town. We next. So let's hurry and pretend that we are changing when you know in your heart you're not changing. And so my vice chancellor is a very good university president, a very good man, in my view. He's a gynecologist. Sorry, not a gynecologist, a gastroenterologist. He doesn't think in his daily life about Southern epistemologies, you know, etc. The vice chancellor of, vice chancellor of many of our universities are legal people, are chemists, are, you know, they're not people. And so we tend to think they must understand what we're talking about.
Yes.
But many of them come from very disciplines. You're lucky if you have, like Wits University, a vice chancellor at the time, like Adam Habib, who's a political scientist, you know, et cetera, who understand, of course, the literatures of Ngugi and so on. So by and large, they don't know what it means, but they do know it means trouble.
Yes.
And so that is why they put up huge amounts of money to get their senates to establish commissions to listen to the students and so on. And the moment the pressure goes down, they revert to normal. And that's a real problem, obviously, because you've got to find ways of keeping that pressure on university presidents in any context, so that this becomes just to give you a simple example. We had a terrible racist article published here about the intelligence and unhealthy lifestyles of colored women. This caused a huge, and the university decided to the Senate, to have a module, a broad module that will address all of these issues for all the students. And so I was asked by some of my colleagues to help them create this module, which I did. It took huge numbers of hours out of my time, but it was useful. That thing has been a pilot now for 4 years, okay? Because we're not serious about change. If we were serious about change, by the way, I did design such a module at my previous university when I was vice chancellor, and every second year student, every first year student, freshman, had to learn broadly about race and identity and change and so on before they can get their degree. Most of my colleagues are not interested because the professor of engineering is simply going to tell you, I already have too little time to teach fluid dynamics, okay? So I'm not going to give you modular time for teaching about decoloniality. And that's the sad thing. Institutions, as you know, Prof. McConney, only respond to pressure if they're going to change anything at all.
So let me talk more as a linguist. Are we saying that the problem about the decolonial discussions in South Africa, for example, had more to do with that we did not pay sufficient attention to how we were articulating our messages? That to some extent, we assumed that everybody understood what we're talking about. So there was not, just as a linguist, that we did not then say, how do we articulate this to bring on board people who we may not be usually engaged in a common conversation with? That we did not turn the language back onto ourselves.
That is absolutely correct. You know, and as somebody who both has a science degree, a natural science degree, as well as education and social science degrees, this is exactly the problem. And so you would literally have hundreds of professors sitting in a charged Senate hall as the students and these activists are addressing, but all of them come from cultural studies. All of them come from gender studies. All of them come from, you know, the sociology, radical sociology. So they are a community that uses, which you'd understand as a linguist, of course, that use a particular way of talking about the world.
Yes.
But for the professor of nanotechnology, it's madness.
Yeah.
Okay. And so part of being smart, in my view, politically smart, is being able to take the complexity of your discipline and make it accessible for a broader set of people so that everybody can participate. But you can't tell people to change when they don't understand what you're talking about.
This is interesting. Let me read to you a couple of lines from a book that Christine Severo and myself have been writing on these topics. And there's a paragraph that says, the consideration of self-transcending decoloniality, which Lewis Gordon proposes, raises an important problem of what follows when decoloniality becomes an objective as opposed to a means. Without carefully reflecting on what decoloniality is for, it becomes a slogan with limited intellectual significance. For instance, fetishism and moralism appeal to models of purity. The need to go beyond decoloniality or transcend decoloniality means, and I think this is where you and me would agree, being able to clearly articulate and depict the nature of the world which we are aspiring toward, right? That the decolonial argument makes more sense. It's a futuristic argument to some extent. You're making a critique of the past, but you need to be able, if I say I'm going to decolonize linguistics, applied linguistics, geography, physics, it's my responsibility to clearly articulate, whether in curriculum terms, assessment, what that discipline would look like, right? That so that decoloniality needs to transcend decoloniality in order to be effective, right? That it needs to go beyond that so that you are able to describe the brave new world that you have got in mind. Yeah. But that's where your interest about curriculum and political action become quite critical, I think.
I completely agree with you. And I have to say, I can kick myself that I didn't see or read this book and see that particular, because that exactly summarizes what I was trying to say. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Let me give back to Basi, and then other people will come in, then we can always get back. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. A number of comments in the chat. First, Tembinkosi basically agrees with your description of the paradox in, at least one of the paradoxes in South African society, when they write as follows: it is the achievement of utopia created by the discourse of the Freedom Charter, that is, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, whereas 90% of the land and economy is in the hands of erstwhile colonizers, that is the British and Dutch settlers. Whites euphemistically refer to descendants of settlers, including any white person, as a tourist, investor, or a scholar. On the other hand, blacks denotes for many black South Africans exclusively black South Africans, not anyone else from outside of our borders. When the blacks from outside flirt with white South Africans, that is the employers, they are regarded xenophobically. So I think Thembi Kosi is basically supporting your argument, but Esther Ramani says, Prof. Jansen, when you say the decolonization project was not radical enough, what exactly do you mean?
Right. So thank you for Thembi Nkosi's comments. What I meant was, as I referred very briefly, if decolonization means, as it has been taken up by many South African academics or professors, that if I add African content in module 7, then I am decolonizing. That if my medical students learn a bit of isiZulu because they're going to be treating patients in, KwaZulu-Natal, then we are decolonizing. That is nonsense. The biggest racist in your country can speak Spanish. The biggest racist in my country can speak Sesotho. You are not radical because you can speak a bit of somebody else's language, and you're certainly not radical. So my point was, what fundamentally is decolonization about? And here I think Thembi Nkosi is correct. It means dealing with the land issue. It means dealing with inequalities, of all kinds in society. It means dealing with injustice. If it simply means additive content that you splash into your curriculum to give I think we can agree that's not radical. Or let me put it differently, Esther, it's not radical enough.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jansen. Ingrid recalls a vice chancellor once referring to the term decolonization as a bombastic term, and that she never received an answer to that question, what the vice chancellor meant by decolonization being a bombastic term. Then Tutelani says that being Namibian, they do not use the word decolonization, and Tutelani gives several reasons. In the Namibian context, they do not know what that means. Secondly, the term continues to tether them to the colonial period. Thirdly, it does not help them get to know more about the them that existed before colonial intrusion. Tutelani says, my life has been more informed and defined by apartheid than colonialism.
Yeah, that is actually a bunch of stuff there that that's actually quite interesting. On the 7th of March, I'm flying into a place in Namibia called Swakopmund. I'm going to be working for 2 days with teachers. And a friend of mine, a white South African from that area, says to me, listen, I'm really sorry. This is yesterday. She says, I'm really sorry I can't come to your workshop in Swakopmund, but I hope the Germans treat you well. I thought to myself, that's a very interesting idea, because as my my brother would tell you, that not only in Windhoek, but in other parts of Namibia, you could walk in there and the street names are Strasses, and the butcher has Wors, and the place names and so on and so forth. So those colonial legacies are absolutely part and parcel of us. Don't ever forget that long before there was the National Socialism and the genocide against the Jews and others, that there was the genocide of the Hereros, in Namibia. So this, Namibia carries that pain lightly, I have to say, but it is absolutely devastating and has legacies in the present. And so there is no question that being aware of that longer history is important, even though I understand, and that would certainly be true for my generation, is that what you felt was not colonialism in your oppressive experiences, but apartheid, both in Namibia and in South Africa. South Africa, of course, occupied, for those who don't know, Namibia for a long period of time. And so on. So Namibia is a bit more complex. You don't see the anxiety, the angst that you see in South Africa around inequality and injustice. And that is a much more complicated discussion, a complex discussion. Yeah, and so, you know, I think decolonization is an important language. In and of itself, I don't think it's bombastic, but as in the discussion between Sinfree and myself, when the language is simply meant to impress, when the language is meant to signal a direction, but it doesn't deal with the harsh realities of what you experience as poor, as women in a country with one of the highest rates of you know, gender-based violence. We even have a term for that. Then all of the other things doesn't seem as, you know, as relevant. And that's why, for me, as a teacher, teaching people, you know, about the meanings of decolonization is a very, very important part of understanding the broader pretext for our current travels. By the way, let me just put a punch in here as well for my Whoopi Goldberg. You know, again, America lost a huge opportunity there to have an educational discussion about what Whoopi might have meant, you know, as opposed to simply shutting down that conversation and having her apologize and so on, all of which is fine, but it doesn't deal with the issue that the meanings of race in the 1940s is not at all clear, you know, to people who make very simple distinctions between race identity and oppression.
Okay, thank you. So let me take a question from Professor Salikoko Mufwene, and then I'll return to the chat thereafter. Salikoko?
Yes, thank you, Professor Jansen, for a very informative and thought-provoking presentation. And one particular thing that really caught my attention is what I take to be an invitation to evolve from just referring to decoloniality or decolonization as a buzz term, but to unpack it and think of how variously it applies to different domains. And for instance, I think of political decoloniality that is different, separate from economic decoloniality. And these particular forms of decoloniality do not necessarily happen concurrently. So for instance, most of sub-Saharan Africa, or typically all of sub-Saharan Africa, has accomplished political decoloniality, but not necessarily economic decoloniality. And when we deal with, for instance, universities, there are different ways in which one must consider the application of decoloniality. So for instance, the students, as you discussed them in South Africa, were more focused on structural decoloniality, not necessarily on the coloniality of or decoloniality of the curriculum of knowledge. As a matter of fact, some of them actually fight for decolonizing the curriculum, but how do you go about doing it? Is it enough to replace the white faculty with the black faculty? What if the black faculty are not mentally decolonized and continue just what they had learned? And so creating more and more positions for the non-white faculty is not necessarily engaging in another dimension of decolonization, which really involves decolonizing knowledge. And so it looks like it's in the context of universities, it's multifaceted. and different facets of it must be approached differently, both in terms of research domains, but also in terms of whether there are issues of contents or methodology that arise in particular domains, which may lead to improving the situation. So I guess it's like, in the language of Derrida, you deconstruct things in such a way that you can reconstruct them in more constructive and beneficial ways for all. Am I correct in deriving these kinds of conclusions?
Yeah, Prof. Mufwene, I would like to invite you to South Africa as soon as possible, because you are making a number of points that when I make it, I risk all kinds of, but you're quite correct, of course, that there are that when you use decolonization, you have to sort of say, in what context am I talking about decolonization? So you talk about the political decolonization, which is a fairly clear concept. If you think about the ways in which in the 1960s and 70s, for example, we spoke about decolonization, our most prominent theorists like Fanon and others. But that's a very different thing from economic decolonization, and a very, very different thing from cultural decolonization, which is, I think, very much what drove a lot of the student actions. But there is one thing that you mentioned that I want to amplify, which is a very big mistake in South Africa, because we essentialize everything, racially and politically. The assumption that having more Black faculty implies having more radical thought is nonsense. I can prove that to you, And very often the people who are at the forefront, if you think of the South African academics, professors who got killed, or who were at the forefront, people like Eddie Webster at Wits, or the professor who was shot and killed in his home in Natal, as it was called at the time. These were radicals, etc. And then you think of a whole range of Bantustan leaders. How on earth do they even figure? And that Bantustan thinking is still, as I said yesterday in East London, in the Eastern Cape, is still very much alive among academics, etc. And so by asking these questions, I think you enable a much more critical engagement with a necessary term. But there wasn't much of that, I have to be honest, in the heat of the moment. So I completely agree with you.
If I can add something, there's something else that you said that really caught my attention, and that's that regards indigenous people, indigeneity in general. And for me, it's a problem in linguistics where we talk about the endangerment of indigenous languages. I don't embrace the term indigenous as it is used in linguistics, nor as it is used in cultural studies, because indigenous has become synonymous with colonized people, and not necessarily native to a particular territory and so forth. And in the way it has been framed, actually we have created a vicious circle between academia and UNESCO, because academia says this is the term used by UNESCO, and UNESCO says this is the term that has been suggested to us by academics. But then it really makes the subject matter of language endangerment more confusing, in the sense that it has become provincialized. The problem of language endangerment and the endangerment of culture and so forth has become provincialized just for people of non-European descent. And that really keeps us from developing a better knowledge of what endangerment means. And why, one question I asked in one of my papers is, when I go to Europe, shall I assume that there are no indigenous people in Europe?
Yes.
Okay? Or that language endangerment has never taken place in Europe? What is that? And it's a matter of changing the terminology. And another colleague who is Swede, he said, well, you know, in some parts of Africa during the colonial period, the term indigenous was used derogatively. People that are uncivilized and so forth. What do we make of this connotation now that the term indigenous has been popularized and people are not questioning the notion? So, and your take on this is really, you know, I found it very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. There are very many comments, questions in the chat. So if you don't mind, Professor Jansen, I may take them in twos or threes.
Oh.
There's a question around the relationship between Ubuntu and the conversation around decoloniality. So Vida says, how does the deployment of the concept of Ubuntu internationally, for example, with respect to indigenous relational knowledge production in the face of positivism, scienticism, and epistemicide, figure into the entire discussion on decoloniality? And if I may, Busi also speaks to your issue around the context that decolonization originated from a different context. And for it to have meaning in the South African environment, it would in all probability have required redefining, just as you alluded to in your talk. And then Joe asks you to kindly explain what you understand by impressive curriculum initiatives.
Okay, thank you very much. So Ubuntu is one of those concepts that is, and I've written about this in Knowledge and Power, and sorry, Knowledge in the Blood, one of my books, that is a desperately, you know, a concept desperately in need of critical engagement, because it is used very often by the political classes to and the middle classes to suggest, you know, this wonderful notion of you know, I am because of you, you know, without you I don't exist, my fullness is only expressed in relation to the recognition of the other, all of which is agreeable. I mean, I don't disagree with that. It has a very powerful root meaning, but people forget that the history of Ubuntu as a concept was very much part of Zulu nationalism under then the Inkatha Freedom Party and its leader at the time, you know, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. So this notion that these concepts have an untainted history, a wholeness about them, you know, is just nonsense. And so the first thing is to look at where this concept comes from. The second thing is to understand the meaninglessness of this concept in one of the most violent countries in the world. You know, we deny each other's existence, you know, through violence. Talk to me about Ubuntu in the context of the July riots in Durban and Johannesburg in 2021. I can't see Ubuntu, you know. Having said that, there are many ordinary people in South Africa, they might not evoke Ubuntu as a concept, who give their lives for others, who spend every cent in the advancement of other people. Probably the most prominent case, but he's certainly not the only case, is Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman of Gift of the Givers, who goes not just to South Africa, but goes to Somalia, goes to Guinea, goes to dangerous parts of the world. And the other day, he took doctors to a place, every discipline in the medical field, to a place that government doesn't want to go to. So we have more philanthropic organizations in South Africa than anywhere else on the continent of Africa. So there is that sense. Whether people call it Ubuntu or not is another debate. But I'm just saying, if you're going to use that term and use it without critical goggles on at the same time, then it very much, could descend into Zulu nationalism, where it had its origins, and to a meaninglessness in the 21st century in the context of an incredibly violent society. And so it's like the Rainbow Nation. It's a good idea, that the late Archbishop Tutu put on the table, but it has all kinds of dangers associated with it unless you deal with the problem of inequality, injustice, violence, and the like. I agree with obviously one of the speakers that we have to sort of say, what does decolonization mean in the context of South Africa? That debate did not happen because it was assumed that because Fanon used it and because Chinua Achebe used it, that it has exactly the same translational meanings in South Africa in the context of a democratic state in the 21st century. None of those finer points were entertained in the heat of the moment. When I say impressive curricula, I'm thinking of two chapters that Cyril and I did. One is looking at the social sciences and humanities. The other is looking at the natural sciences. What made these impressive curricula? I'll give you 3 or 4 features of it. Number one, all of them dealt with the issue of knowledge and power. Okay, so they weren't simply preparing students for careers or preparing students, with enough content knowledge. They were dealing with archaeology, with polymer chemistry, with civil engineering in the context of the knowledge power debates. That seems to me to be impressive. The second thing is they brought these different curricula to the attention of students without necessarily using the arcane language of decolonization. In other words, they made it accessible for students from any discipline in order to participate. Thirdly, they found ways of connecting the ideas in the curriculum to the radical project for institutional change. They weren't only trying to change the curriculum for archaeology students or for media studies students, but to sort of say, what does this mean for changing the university? All of them worked with that. They brought critical texts into that curriculum that most students would never ever engage in accountancy or actuarial science or econometrics. And so that was impressive about it. It made available to all students and in an accessible form, a radical language that linked curriculum change to institutional change. That's what I meant by impressive.
Okay, thank you very much. And Scott would like to pose a question directly to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. I did write something in the chat, but I'm just going to rephrase it slightly. So what I think I'm hearing in your argument is a fundamental incoherence between the claim that what we really should have had in that moment was a more radical movement. It wasn't radical enough. It wasn't committed enough, etc. And your acceptance that structural change in South Africa needs to happen. We need to eradicate inequality. We need to completely rethink the structure of our society, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, this claim that we can blame the activists themselves for being impolite, for disrupting things, for coming into spaces and being rude to professors. And I think that's fundamentally wrong-headed. It gets the whole idea. I mean, you talk about having a theory of social change or kind of social action. If you actually want these changes in South Africa to happen, then surely, as an elder, as somebody who is part of the establishment in South Africa, and the rest of us who have structural power in the South African context, we shouldn't be blaming the students. They gave us an opportunity to do something fantastic, and we missed that opportunity ourselves, and we did not restructure our society. So I find pointing the finger at students, saying they were arrogant, saying they were impolite, saying they were pissing people off, fundamentally misses the point.
Actually, Scott, I wasn't referring to students. I was referring to people like you. I was referring to the staff. And in fact, there's a whole chapter on UCT's staff who were the aggressors, who threatened people if they spoke up, who spoke the way you just did to me, in a way that doesn't invite dialogue, but that makes claims about in the way that you did. So no, I wasn't. In fact, we spent quite a bit of time saying it was necessary for the students to raise these issues in the way that they did, that disruption was a good thing. Otherwise, how do you bring to attention of the faculties, the Senate, and in particular the Vice Chancellors, the kinds of issues that they brought to the table? I don't think we would have had a decolonization debate at all if there wasn't a student moment that drew our attention, as with the fees must fall, by the way. So in the context of the book anyway, the issue is not the students. We didn't interview students, except a few, because this book was about the academic response to decolonization. And in that context, it was liberals, white liberals in particular, who made it difficult to get the attention of institutional actors who were outside of the social science and humanities disciplines. That was my point, and so on. And that kind of change is possible, even within the constrictions, as you correctly point out, of the structural and other kinds of inequalities in the broader society. So I don't have any illusions that changing the curriculum is going to change basically the logics of a capitalist economy in South Africa. I mean, I understand how those things work, nor is it going to wonderfully transform an essentially corrupt state. So that part is very clear to me. We should be able to talk about both those things with the same kind of confidence, the need for structural change, and where we can, in the context of institutions that are often a century old, about what are the tactics and the strategies that enable us to get there. So with the students, I have peace. I have a huge issue with academic staff in South African universities, particularly white liberals, who speak without any sense of self-awareness about their own position of privilege, and then go into senates and make it very, very difficult for anybody else to speak. And as one colleague put it at UCT, I'm not going to commit career suicide by responding to the radical document put out by the academics on the website of the University of Cape Town. That, Scott, is what I'm talking about.
It's a complete misrepresentation of the discourse. I'm sorry. That is just.
I think you misrepresented what I said, and that is a pity.
Thank you very much, Professor Jansen. Please, may I reiterate the point about decorum in the way we address our guests. There's a comment from Cecil Viguru, who agrees with you that decolonization in South Africa cannot happen without the issue of land being addressed, and more generally, without redressing deep economic inequalities. But the question, as scholars, how can we engage in these endeavors besides producing discourses about them?
Yeah, this is very, very difficult, because the issue of land is central. And I'm not just talking about the people who normally take up the issue, which is, the EFF and the PSC, and so the PSC more, I think, historically, the EFF more recently. This is a huge issue, etc. And so the fact that we have most of the land that is available for redistribution under the control of the state and its the people it funds, for example, the Ngoma Ngonyama trust lands in KwaZulu-Natal. This got nothing to do with white people owning land, even though it is as equally an important issue. Unless we resolve that issue, it's a pain that won't go away, because it's not about land. It is about identity. It is about a sense of recognition. It is about the dispossession that many of us face over the centuries. And so it almost seems, trite to talk about the decolonization of knowledge against the backdrop of these big issues. But we need to be able to do both. As I said in response to Scott, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to find entry points into a more radical critique of the state.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jansen. There's a question on one of your, or perhaps both of your forthcoming books. I think I see a lot of interest has been generated by this talk, and colleagues are eager to know the title of the forthcoming book or books. Could you perhaps just reiterate the titles of your forthcoming books?
Sure. So the Decolonization of Knowledge with Cambridge is in press. It should be out in April. The Decolonization of Knowledge, and it's Jansen and Walters, Cyril Walters, whose name is at the bottom of the screen. Then there is a book that tentatively is titled Bewitched, and it's about the dysfunctionality in 10 South African universities that I wrote alone, and that should be out by the end of the year. And then, just for those of you who are interested, I'm editing a book with an anthropologist called The Politics of Knowledge in the Biomedical Sciences. And this really looks at the history of colonial medicine and its afterlife in disciplines like obstetrics, anatomy, human genetics, is a chapter I wrote, and the like, and clinical psychology.
Okay, just before I take a question from Desmond, Teboho says, thank you for the presentation, Prof. Jansen, for explaining the institutional entrenchment of colonial Eurocentric education that outweighs academic localization. And he wants to know if you have any thoughts on scholarship by, for instance, Professor Santi, who offers an African-centric or a Pan-Africanist approach to liberating education in the global South from Northern hegemonies.
So that's a very important point. And obviously I think Pan-Africanist studies are very, very important in the context of the overwhelming effect of literature on almost anything in the social sciences, humanities, natural sciences, medical sciences from the global North. So absolutely, this is a very important. But I've moved on since then to, in particular, criticizing the works of colleagues like Raywin Cornell in Australia and so on, to sort of say, we need to stop thinking in the context of knowledge production and knowledge and power in a simplistic way that describes all the power as residing in the North and all the powerlessness, that old metaphor that people use in terms of material production. The Westerners come here, they basically take our raw materials, then rework it and then send it back to us. I think that had its time and space in the 1960s and 70s, but I don't think the world works like that anymore. And I use in one of my books called The Decolonization of Universities, several examples to make that point. One of the examples, I'll just use one because there are many. Recently deceased, sadly, a young professor called Bongani Mayosi, and he was one of the world's leading experts on the relationship between poverty and cardiovascular disease. And Bongani, defined his study as poverty in Africa and heart disease, but he did it in a way that brought scholars from his former university, like Oxford and other places, to come and learn about these diseases, to be trained by him, and to then be sent back to their countries to deal with similar issues there. I think a lot of that has happened across Africa that makes the simple metaphor I refer to a little bit more tricky to deal with. You know, think of South Africa right now as occupying this contradictory space that on the one hand identifies through its own scientists the Omicron variant, okay, and the people in the north had real difficulty dealing with this, you know, because you know, maybe they made some mistakes, maybe we can't trust them to travel yet, and that kind of thing. And it was really the global north that was saying, oh shit, you know, not all of that comes from labs in London and Massachusetts and so on and so forth. And so I would like to see, not denying the huge discrepancies in terms of, for example, funding available for research. I mean, that's a huge discrepancy, but not denying that in Africa itself, okay, we are producing knowledge and very often training people from the global north in order to go back and make a difference there. Small streams, but nevertheless, something perhaps of the counter penetration that Ali Mazrui so provocatively talked about.
Okay, so Desmond and then Christine, I'll read your question. Desmond?
Thanks, Professor Jansen, and to everyone who's already spoken on this subject. I anchor my comments/questions on this notion that we cannot decouple the discourse of decolonization from the question of land in South Africa, and I would say even beyond that. So thank you, Cecile, for raising that comment. I think my question is, you know, would it make sense to consider the question of land a better marker of citizenship in South Africa than, say, for instance, the pronouncements of the Constitution? That is to say that we can tell better who has full citizenship in South Africa, but figuring out who has access to and control of the land. And could we also then derive from that argument that there is something in the political DNA of the nation state that ensures inequality, and especially wherever there is people of European descent, to ensure that that inequality works in the favor of those of European descent? Is this part of the arrangement of the nation state? And is that a better way to understand the notion of citizenship? Just to give a different size to this, I think they're having conversations in the US about what citizenship means in the US. Do people of African descent, for instance, possess and have the capacity to enact full citizenship in spite of what the passport says, right? What does it mean to be a citizen? And how is the nation state entangled in the productions of these varieties of citizenships, especially in the ways that is connected to who has access to or control of the land?
It's a fascinating point, and I would agree actually that, I mean, if you're talking about discourses of decolonization, I think it is fundamental to link that to land identity and politics. I don't know if it's a better marker of citizenship, because then all kinds of difficulties arise, not the least of which is when land is expropriated by the state in corrupt societies like Zimbabwe and given to the elites. Does that resolve the question of citizenship? It doesn't. And we've tried this before, by the way. If you just look at South Africa's history in 1936 and in 1956. In 1936, Africans were struck off the voting roll. In 1956, colored people. And what was interesting that up to that point, it was linked, the idea of ownership of land was very much linked to men owning the land, first of all, and secondly, to race. And so I think this would create a very interesting, I mean, conceptually, I suppose it's worth taking up. I just don't know if in the context of Southern Africa, if that resolves the very complex issue of citizenship any better than at least giving people, just by virtue, in fact, I would go beyond birth, because at the moment you're a citizen by virtue of the land you are born in, right? But that in itself is tricky, as you can imagine, especially when you bring in a second passport or, genealogy and so on, which again, a lot of white South Africans, particularly white English South Africans, use to their benefit. When things get rough here, they're able to go back to England or Europe more broadly. So I think there's a complex set of issues here. I don't have the expertise to be able to answer this more intelligently, but I have a gut sense that this is something that needs a lot of teasing out rather than to come up with glib responses, particularly around the politics of land and identity.
Not to put too much of a fine point on this, but I'm actually asking this question not to resolve the question of citizenship, but to problematize it. That is to say, does thinking in this way then expose the reality in such a way that decoloniality probably should be cautious about anchoring its political project on the nation state? Does thinking about citizenship not as a construct, but as a lived reality change the way that we can understand what the problem is and the complexity of the problem before we can even begin to ask questions about resolving it? But thank you.
Fair enough.
Okay, we have two final comments or questions. One is from Christine, who notes, like I guess everybody, how inspiring this has been. But she would like to know what the challenges are for dealing with cross-cultural alliances concerning the politics of decolonization in the face of a multitude of singular experiences of what counts as decolonial. So again, how do we build global solidarities, cross-cultural alliances around the politics of decolonization when the experiences of what decolonization may be are very singular?
Let me see if I can venture a response with not being very, very clear about the question. Look, I think one of the big issues for me in the global decolonization moment is the way in which these issues have been nationalized around particular issues. So if you look at the George Floyd moment, that's a very, very powerful moment in the world. But George Floyd is not just an American problem. George Floyd is a global problem when you think about it. And I think one of the things we've done is that these moments have inspired people around the world. I mentioned, of course, Belgium and the UK, and indeed South Africa. And I think that has been fantastic, but I haven't seen, for example, exchanges of literatures. I haven't seen intellectual projects, that combine these different moments across the world. We're trying to do some of that. And so politics of solidarity around the struggle of land, the struggle of identity, the struggle of, is so important, particularly as countries like the US and South Africa turns inwards, okay? And Hungary is another one that turns inward on its own people, precisely the opposite of what we should have, which is this global solidarity that recognizes these kinds of tendencies across national borders. So I think Christine is onto something. I need to give it a bit more thought, but absolutely, we need global alliances, but more than that, global solidarities around these issues we talked about today.
Okay, finally, Adrian has a question that in a sense puts all of this together, summarizes quite a bit of what has transpired thus far. After thanking you for a very insightful presentation, he says, I have come to understand that decoloniality is a process that requires a logic of contextualization. For example, I dare say that President Mobutu Sese Seko did it with his with its politics of authenticity. The question then is around identifying what needs to be decolonized and how. So he says the how implies the idea of power and knowledge. And he would like your point of view on that. And he wishes he could talk about the situation in Angola, where the Lusophonization of names is important for social stratification.
Yeah, can I just say is it Adrian? I just spoke this afternoon to one of my co-editors of this book on politics and medicine, Jess Auerbach. She's just written an amazing book on Angola, the middle classes in Angola. And then she's also doing another book right now on some underwater sea cable that runs from Brazil to Angola, around South Africa, around the West Coast here actually, all the way through to Southeast Asia. So fascinating stuff happening in among scholars of Angola, etc. I think the how and what of decolonization is a very important starting point. What can one do within the realms of influence, for example, of a student moment like in South Africa and so on and so forth, and what can't you do in the immediate term, but needs to be taken on more broadly in the larger society. Both of those things, as I said, are important. The only warning that I would have is not to deal with these issues in such minute terms that it becomes meaningless. To give an example of this, at Wits University, an senior economist told us, no, they've decolonized the economics curriculum by changing all the signs that said euro and dollar in the economics textbook. They've changed that into rands. Okay. Needless to say, we had to keep a straight face because we are respecting our respondent. But the how must be substantive hours. What are the big things we can change within our sphere of influence? How do we change it? That was my theory of action argument. But that there's an urgency to all of this is very, very clear, not just in South Africa, but around the world. Thank you. And thank you to whoever put up Jess's book title in the chat.
Okay, yes, From Water to Wine. So, dear colleagues, I'm sure we could not possibly find enough of the right kinds of words to say how grateful we are to Professor Jansen for sharing his expertise, his knowledge on these matters with us this afternoon in a very lucid manner. Prof, we're very grateful for your time, and we will be leaving this forum really, really enriched. So I'll yield the floor back to Sinfree for the final words, and then we'll learn about our next speaker from Kim. Sinfree. You're still muted, Sinfree?
Yeah. I want to thank everybody who has attended this forum, and I also want to express my deep gratitude to Professor Jansen for an inspiring talk. What I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is just to extend the argument a little bit. In some cases, I think I'll just be re-echoing what has been said by other people, but perhaps in a slightly different way. I think I agree about the need to contextualize our understanding of decoloniality. But in my mind at the moment, there's a group of scholars who I call the decolonial dissenters, people like Paul Zelezer. And Paul Zelezer makes a very interesting point when he argues that unless we handle the notion of decoloniality carefully, it might be potentially limiting. He argues that it might be potentially limiting because what it forces us to do unintentionally is we restrict our thinking to Eurocentric considerations. So we then don't take into account other types of knowledge libraries which exist in Africa and around the world, which might not have been affected by coloniality. It's an interesting argument because the Nigerian philosopher Taiwo makes a similar point when he says we should not underestimate the impact of colonization, but we should not overestimate it because historically, he points out, colonization was just for a period of about a century and a half. The interesting thing for me, following on this argument, is that one of the reasons why I am more inclined to talk of Southern epistemologies than decoloniality is that decolonization, for example, forces me to focus my thinking on coloniality only. But when I shift gears and talk about Southern epistemologies, I broaden the range of parameters that I can bring to view. I can talk about capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. So from a very narrow view, I feel that Southern epistemologies as a way of going about this, of addressing this issue, is potentially much more liberating to me, but not necessarily to everyone, because then I don't get stuck in discussions about colonization and coloniality. Colonization and coloniality simply then become one of the key dimensions that I have to try and address. I also completely agree with the issue of linking decoloniality to land. For example, I would even push it further and say that it's not so much land only, it's a question of reparation, that decolonization of the universities or whatever it is going to be have to be linked to the materialities of land, and then you have to move on to discussions about reparations. That you can't decolonize American universities or etc. without having to address issues about reparations. So decolonization in that case is useful insofar as it opens up a debate that has to proceed much further and ends up, at least for me at the moment, on discussions about reparation. But listening to Professor Jansen, he keeps reminding us of the need to be able to come up with what he calls in his paper, theories of political action. And I think that's what we need to keep thinking about. Thank you very much, Professor Jansen.
Thank you.